Who is your worst client? Story 1. I'm a criminal defense lawyer, and one of my worst clients was a guy who'd been caught red-handed in a drug trafficking case. He was facing serious charges and his defense was going to be tough, but there was hope. The problem wasn't the case, it was him. From the very beginning, he insisted on doing things his way. He didn't trust my legal expertise and kept telling me how to handle the case. He'd call me multiple times a day, often about insignificant details that didn't matter to the case. Every time I tried to give him advice, he'd refuse to listen, convinced he knew better than I did. Then, during one of our court appearances, he started causing a scene in the courtroom, arguing with the judge about a minor procedural issue. The judge warned him twice to calm down, but he kept going. By the end of the day, the judge had imposed an additional fine for contempt of court, which only made his situation worse. He thought I was the one who'd messed up, even though it was his behavior causing all the problem. He never took responsibility for his actions, and in the end, he was convicted. The worst part? After the trial, he still had the nerve to ask for a refund because, in his mind, I hadn't done enough. To this day, I tell all new clients to trust their lawyer's judgment. Story 2. I'm a family law attorney, and I once had a client who was an absolute nightmare to work with. She was going through a divorce, but her bitterness toward her soon-to-be ex-husband seemed to be clouding her judgment. Instead of focusing on what was fair and reasonable, she was fixated on punishing him at any cost. She'd send me angry emails at all hours demanding I destroy him. Every phone call was filled with rage, and she'd even accuse me of not doing enough when I was advising her to take a more rational approach. At one point, I recommended mediation as a way to avoid a long, expensive court battle. She agreed to it in theory, but immediately sabotaged every attempt at compromise. During one mediation session, she threw a tantrum because her ex-husband didn't apologize for something he said years ago. It wasn't about the money or custody of the children anymore. It was about her need to be vindicated. Eventually, her case dragged on for months longer than it should have. In the end, she received a far less favorable settlement than I originally recommended. Looking back, I think she was more focused on winning the emotional battle than anything else. She sent me a thank you note, but I knew it wasn't sincere. I was just glad it was finally over. Story 3. I'm a civil litigator, and one of the most challenging clients I've ever worked with had no concept of legal reality. He was suing a major corporation for a personal injury claim after a minor accident. The accident itself wasn't severe, but the client insisted that the corporation was somehow to blame for everything in his life going wrong. He demanded a huge payout, far more than was reasonable, based on an exaggerated injury claim. The issue wasn't just his unrealistic expectations, it was the fact that he wouldn't listen to reason. Every time I'd try to explain that his claims were inflated or that we needed more evidence to support his case, he'd throw a tantrum. He wanted to go to court immediately, despite the fact that his case had no solid foundation. I had to talk him down multiple times from making threats to the opposing lawyers, which only made things worse. When we finally settled, he was unhappy because it wasn't as much money as he'd hoped. But honestly, it was the best outcome for him considering the circumstances. What still frustrates me is how he wasted so much time and energy pursuing something that was doomed from the start. Clients like him make you question if the whole system is worth it. Story 4. I work as a corporate lawyer, and once I had a client who was a small business owner. He came to me with a seemingly simple contract dispute with a vendor. However, from the start, he was incredibly difficult. He had no real idea of what he wanted, but he had an opinion on everything. Every draft of a settlement agreement I sent him would come back with pages of revisions, often contradict. One day, he'd insist on adding a clause that would make the contract virtually unenforceable, and the next day, he'd argue that it needed to be simpler and shorter. It felt like he was playing a game where he didn't care about the rules. He just wanted to feel in control. His lack of decisiveness dragged the whole process on for far too long. At one point, I suggested we meet in person to discuss things and get to a resolution. He agreed, but on the day of the meeting, he sent a list of additional demands instead of showing up. By the time we got the dispute settled, I was mentally exhausted. What made it worse was that after everything was finished, he sent me an angry email about how I hadn't fought hard enough for him. I had given him so much of my time and effort, but it never felt like it was enough. Sometimes I wonder if he even understood the value of the service he was paying. Story 5. As a personal injury lawyer, I once had a client who was probably the most unreasonable person I've ever worked with. He came to me after a minor slip-and-fall incident in a grocery store. His injury was barely noticeable, and he had no long-term consequences, but he insisted that he was entitled to a huge payout. I explained that it wasn't a strong case and that pursuing it further would only lead to frustration, but he wasn't having it. He demanded that I go after the store's insurance company for a 6-figure settlement. The thing about him was that he would never listen to advice, no matter how many times I explained the realities of personal injury cases. He constantly pressured me to take actions that were completely unrealistic. Whenever I told him a settlement wasn't likely or that we needed to adjust our expectations, he would get angry and accuse me of not fighting hard enough. At one point, he threatened to report me to the Bar Association, claiming I was wasting his time. In the end, his case got thrown out, and the store's legal team countersued for frivolous litigation. He still blamed me for not winning, even though there was no case to win. It taught me a hard lesson about managing client expectations. No matter how much experience you have, some people just don't understand that not every case is winnable. Story 6. I've been working as an immigration lawyer for almost 10 years, and while I've dealt with a variety of cases, one client still stands out in my mind for all the wrong reasons. She was an individual who had been living in the country illegally for over a decade and wanted to apply for permanent residency. On the surface, it seemed like a straightforward case, but it quickly became apparent that she had some serious misunderstandings about how the system worked. First, she was convinced that there was a special loophole for people like her and that it was only a matter of time before she would be granted her green card. No amount of explanation about the process, how long it could take, how much documentation we'd need, or the likelihood of complications could convince her otherwise. She was adamant that her case should be expedited simply because she had been living here for so long. And every time we faced a delay or a request for additional documentation, she would demand to know why I wasn't doing enough to push the process along. Things only got worse when she started demanding that I write letters of support for her case from various prominent individuals, regardless of whether or not they knew her personally. She'd hand me a list of people she wanted me to contact, and when I explained that these letters would need to come from individuals with real knowledge of her situation, she argued that I should simply ask them anyway. The final straw came when I got a call from her late one night, absolutely furious that her application had been denied. She blamed me entirely, accusing me of sabotaging her case. She even threatened to report me to the state bar. Unfortunately, her case wasn't strong, but I had done everything within my power to help her. I just couldn't get her to understand the limitations. At the end of the day, she was the one who failed to take responsibility for her own actions. And she ultimately left the country on her own terms, with no resolve. Story 7. As a real estate lawyer, I've dealt with my fair share of tricky clients. But there was one individual who really tested my patience. She was selling a small house and had hired me to handle the closing process. On paper, it was a simple transaction, but things quickly started to spiral. The first sign that she was going to be difficult was when she wanted to change every detail of the contract. She claimed that the standard clauses weren't good enough, despite me explaining multiple times that they were in line with industry norms. She insisted on making the deal more complex, demanding things like a unique clause to guarantee her a higher profit margin if the buyer sold the house within 5 years. I spent hours on the phone with her, trying to explain the ramifications of some of her demands, but she wouldn't budge. She wanted me to push the buyer into agreeing to conditions that were simply unreasonable, and when I explained that doing so would likely cause the deal to fall apart, she just repeated that I was not trying hard enough. As we got closer to the closing date, she became increasingly paranoid, questioning everything from the buyer's financing to the home inspection. Even after everything was cleared up, she demanded that I renegotiate the price because she thought the buyer could pay more. At that point, I tried to tell her that she needed to take the deal and move forward, but she refused. Finally, she delayed the closing by several weeks, and during that time, she managed to scare off the buyer by continuously demanding unreasonable terms. The deal eventually fell through, and she ended up with no sale. In the end, she blamed me for not getting her the price she deserved and ended up sending me a scathing review online. Sometimes, no matter how much effort you put into a case, there's no winning with certain clients. Story 8. I practice healthcare law, specifically dealing with compliance issues for healthcare providers. A few years ago, I had a client who owned a chain of urgent care clinics. At first, he seemed like a solid businessman, but soon enough, I realized he was deeply unethical in his operations. He routinely violated healthcare regulations to maximize his profits, from overbilling insurance companies to cutting corners on patient care. He approached me to fix his legal issues when the government began investigating his clinics. Instead of taking responsibility, he tried to push all the blame onto his employees, even though he was the one who had set the culture of shortcuts and non-compliance. It became clear that he wasn't looking for genuine legal help. He was more interested in covering his tracks and finding loopholes to keep his business running, despite his shady practices. Every conversation with him was a battle. He constantly demanded that I help him circumvent the law, asking me to write contracts that could mislead auditors or find technicalities to reduce penalties. When I refused and told him he needed to take responsibility and fix his practices, He threatened to report me for being too cautious and not being a real lawyer. The worst part was when he tried to bribe me. He offered me a huge financial incentive if I could somehow make the investigations go away. I was appalled and immediately cut ties with him. He later filed a complaint with the state bar, but I knew I had done the right thing by distancing myself. Unfortunately, the case eventually went public, and he lost his business. I'm grateful I didn't get dragged into it, but it's an experience I'll never forget. Story 9. I've worked as a contract lawyer for a few years now, and while most clients have been reasonable, there was one who took the cake. This client, a young startup founder, hired me to draft contracts for his small but rapidly growing tech company. At first, everything seemed fine. However, the more I worked with him, the more evident it became that he had an inflated sense of his company's worth and a complete lack of respect for the legal process. He would demand revisions at the last minute, frequently ignoring the fact that the contracts had already been through several drafts and approvals. The worst part was when he started sending me emails at all hours of the night, demanding changes based on his gut feeling. Every time I'd explain why something was legally unfeasible or why a certain clause wasn't in his best interest, he would brush me off with phrases like, "I've done my research," or "It doesn't matter, we just need to get it signed." He once tried to force a partner into signing a contract by threatening them with legal action for something that wasn't even covered in the contract. When I advised against this approach, he became belligerent and claimed I didn't understand the startup. His attitude eventually led to a massive rift with one of his partners, which resulted in a lawsuit. Throughout the whole ordeal, he blamed me for the fallout, even though I had been trying to warn him about the consequences of his actions. In the end, his company was embroiled in a nasty legal battle, and the contracts I had drafted became a source of contention. The most frustrating part was how little he valued the legal work I did until everything fell apart. It was a painful reminder that some clients will never understand the importance of thoughtful, careful legal work until it's too late. Story 10. I'm an estate planning lawyer, and one of the most exhausting clients I had was an elderly man who wanted to create a will to ensure his estate was distributed according to his wishes. On the surface, this should have been a simple case, but he couldn't make up his mind about anything. Every time we would discuss the terms of the will, he would change his mind. He would say one thing and then later tell me he didn't want to include his children in the inheritance, only to reverse that decision the next day. Each meeting with him felt like a new round of indecision. I would carefully prepare drafts of his will, and then he'd want to make major changes that contradicted what we'd discussed before. It was impossible to get anything finalized because he couldn't stick to a decision. On top of that, he had a long list of people he wanted to cut out of the will, including several relatives who had done nothing but support him over the years. I spent weeks negotiating with him, trying to bring clarity to his desires, only for him to turn around and change his mind yet again. I began to realize that his problem wasn't a lack of understanding. It was that he couldn't let go of control, and his wish was to create chaos rather than leave behind any sense of closure. Finally, after months of back and forth, we managed to draft a will that seemed to meet his needs, but even after signing it, he kept asking to make one last change. I never heard from him again after that, but I later found out that he had rewritten the will on his own, further complicating matters. I've come to realize that some clients are just never satisfied, no matter how much time and effort you put into their case. Story 11. I work as a patent attorney, and one of my most difficult clients was a tech entrepreneur who had an idea he was certain would revolutionize the world. He came to me with what he thought was a groundbreaking invention, essentially a piece of software he claimed would change the way businesses operate. It was complex, and while the idea seemed promising, the execution was lacking. As we went over the paperwork, it became clear to me that there were already similar patents out, and his invention wasn't as original as he believed. I tried to explain to him that we might face challenges getting a patent because of prior art, but he refused to listen. He was convinced that his idea was unique, despite my multiple attempts to show him otherwise. Every time I brought up the issue of existing patents, he would grow defensive and start telling me how other firms had told him he was on the brink of something big, and that I just needed to push the boundaries of the law. He kept insisting that I spin the patent application in a way that would make it appear more unique. His demands were exhausting. He wanted to file a patent application for an idea that wasn't original, with descriptions and claims that couldn't possibly be defended in court. I tried to explain the importance of properly defining the scope of the invention and ensuring it would stand up in the future, but he kept ignoring my advice. When we finally submitted the application, it was rejected within a few months, just as I had predicted. He was furious with me, convinced that I had somehow mishandled the process. His anger was so extreme that he threatened to report me to the state bar for professional negligence, even though I had followed the legal procedure and given him my best advice. The most frustrating part was that after the rejection, he turned to a competitor and asked them to file the same application, hoping for a different outcome. I eventually decided I couldn't keep working with someone who wouldn't listen to professional guidance, so I parted ways. It was a huge lesson in how difficult some clients can be when they're not open to honest feedback. Story 12. I practice tax law, and a few years ago I had a client who came to me with a massive problem. He hadn't filed taxes in over 5 years. He was a small business owner, and his income was irregular, but instead of filing and paying taxes as required, he had ignored his obligations, hoping the issue would just disappear. By the time he reached out to me, the IRS had come knocking, and he was facing serious back taxes, penalties, and interest. At first, I was hopeful that we could work something out. I began reviewing his financial records, and we started discussing payment plans and ways to minimize the damage. But then I realized just how deep his denial ran. He refused to believe that the IRS could actually do anything significant to him. Every time I explained the potential consequences, seizure of assets, wage garnishments, or even jail time, he'd dismiss it as scare tactics. Things really took a turn when we began discussing how to get his past filings in order. I suggested he come clean with the IRS, disclose his back taxes, and then work toward a settlement. Instead of listening to my advice, he decided to just ignore the IRS and hope it would blow over. He started sending me angry emails, telling me that he wasn't going to roll over and admit anything to the government. I explained that doing nothing would make things worse, but he became more entrenched in his position. He demanded that I find a way to magically reduce his debt without any of the typical steps required in tax resolution. I tried multiple strategies, and even suggested an offer in compromise, but he was convinced there was a shortcut. After months of working on his case, the IRS ultimately garnished his wages, and he was livid, still blaming me for his situation. In the end, his refusal to face reality made his situation much worse than it needed to be. He ended up with a much higher tax burden than we originally anticipated, and there was little I could do to reverse the damage. He sent me a scathing letter accusing me of ruining his life, but the truth was, his own failure to take responsibility had led him to this. Story 13. I'm an employment lawyer, and I once had a client who, while well-meaning, was incredibly frustrating to deal with. He was a mid-level manager at a large company and was seeking legal help for a workplace discrimination claim. He believed that his employer had discriminated against him on the basis of age, and although there were some merits to his case, his approach was completely unproductive. When we first met, he seemed reasonable and clear about the nature of his complaints. But as we dug into the details of the case, it became clear that he had an obsessive need for validation. Every time he spoke about his experience at work, he would exaggerate or embellish details, making his case seem more dramatic than it really was. His claims began to sound more like personal grievances and less like legitimate legal concerns. During one of our meetings, he told me that he wanted to sue them all, and that he didn't just want compensation. He wanted to ruin the company and make sure no one would ever do this to him again. This wasn't a good approach for an employment discrimination case, and I repeatedly advised him to focus on resolution rather than vengeance. But he wouldn't listen. The situation escalated when he started showing up at his workplace unannounced and calling his former colleagues, trying to get them to back his version of events. He became fixated on his claim, constantly texting and emailing me with new demands, some of which weren't even related to the legal strategy at hand. Eventually, his actions led to a breakdown in the legal process. His former employer became defensive, and their lawyers dug in their heels. I tried to salvage the case, but his inability to let go of his emotions and desire for retribution caused unnecessary delays and complications. Ultimately, he settled for a fraction of what he could have received if he had been patient and pragmatic. What was worse, his reputation at the company was permanently damaged, and he ended up without a proper reference for future employment. In the end, his failure to manage his emotions, along with his inability to trust the legal process, turned what could have been a straightforward case into a complicated mess. Story 14. I work in environmental law, and I once had a client who was involved in a long-running dispute with a local government about zoning laws. She owned a piece of property that she had been trying to develop into a commercial space for years. However, the local zoning laws prohibited certain types of development on her land, and she was convinced that she could somehow bypass the restrictions. From the beginning, it was clear that my client was deeply frustrated by the situation. She'd spent a lot of money on preliminary designs and planning, only to find that the local government wouldn't approve her plans because they violated zoning laws. Rather than seeking a compromise or finding a way to work within the system, she became fixated on breaking through the system and getting approval for her development at all costs. Despite my advice, she insisted on filing several legal challenges against the local government. Each time one of her challenges was rejected, she became more aggressive, sending me long lists of demands and blaming me for her failures. She refused to accept the idea that the zoning laws were in place for a reason, and she didn't want to explore alternative solutions such as changing the scope of her project or pursuing a variance. One day, she contacted me with a new idea. She wanted to hire a public relations firm to try to sway public opinion in her favor. I told her that this was a bad idea and that her legal strategy was far more important than a PR campaign. She disregarded my advice and spent thousands of dollars on a media blitz, which only made the situation worse. The public backlash caused the local government to dig in even further, and her application for a variance was rejected. By the time we reached a final resolution, the costs had spiraled out of control, and she walked away with a fraction of what she could have gotten had she taken a more measured approach. To this day, I try to explain to my clients the importance of working within the law rather than against it, but it's a lesson some people only learn the hard way. Story 15. I specialize in business law, and one client stands out in my memory as the most frustrating individual I've ever had to work. He was the owner of a small but rapidly growing tech startup and came to me with a legal issue regarding the company's intellectual property. He had recently hired a team of engineers to develop proprietary software, but he had neglected to sign proper contracts, including non-compete and confidentiality agreements. The issue came to a head when one of his employees left the company and started working for a competitor. The ex-employee took with them some of the proprietary code, and my client wanted to sue for intellectual property theft. At first, I explained the importance of contracts and how this situation could have been avoided if he'd properly protected his business in the first place. Instead of accepting responsibility, he blamed everyone else for his oversight. What made the situation worse was his constant micromanagement of the legal process. Every time I suggested a course of action, he would immediately second-guess it and demand alternative strategies. He spent more time criticizing my advice than actually working with me to find a solution. When I filed a lawsuit on his behalf, he started sending daily emails, nitpicking every small detail about the case. He would call me at all hours, asking questions about minor procedural points, and often interrupting my work to offer suggestions that had no legal merit. In the end, the case became a complete mess. The lack of proper contracts meant that the intellectual property claim was weak, and we ultimately had to settle for a much smaller sum than my client had hoped. To add insult to injury, after the settlement, he still had the audacity to demand a discount on my legal fees, claiming that the outcome wasn't good enough. I've learned that no matter how big the paycheck, some clients will always make your job harder than it needs to be. Story 16. I've been a divorce lawyer for over 15 years, and while I've seen my fair share of challenging clients, one in particular stands out. This woman came to me after her marriage had ended, seeking a divorce from her husband. At first, everything seemed straightforward, but it quickly became clear that she had an agenda. She wasn't interested in a fair division of assets or even just moving on. She was obsessed with making her husband suffer. She was adamant about dragging out the divorce as long as possible. Every time I suggested mediation or even a quick settlement, she refused, insisting on taking every issue to court. She claimed that her husband had wronged her in every possible way, even though there was no real evidence to support many of her claims. Her bitterness clouded her judgment, and she would constantly call me with new allegations or demands. It became evident that she wanted to punish him more than she wanted to settle the case. She insisted on including every small detail in the divorce proceedings, like the fact that he didn't do enough household chores or how he once borrowed her car without asking. While I understand that emotions run high during divorces, her fixation on insignificant issues made it impossible to make progress. It wasn't about the kids, the property, or the future. It was all about revenge. The situation got worse when she started undermining my advice and demanding that I go for things that were entirely unreasonable. When I advised her to let go of certain points that would only make the situation worse for her, she would dismiss me, claiming that I wasn't fighting hard enough. The entire process dragged on for over 2 years. By the time the divorce was finalized, the bitterness between them had only deepened. She ended up with far less than I had initially predicted because of her refusal to settle. In the end, she blamed me for not getting her everything she wanted, even though the outcome was entirely a result of her own choices. Story 17. I'm an intellectual property lawyer, and a few years ago I had a client who was an aspiring inventor with an idea he was convinced would change the world. He had come up with an invention for a smart kitchen appliance that he thought would revolutionize home cooking. The only problem was that he hadn't done much research into existing patents, and his concept was eerily similar to a product already on the market. When we first met, he was excited and full of confidence. He handed me a sketch and explained his vision in great detail. I immediately recognized that his idea wasn't original, so I tried to explain the concept of prior art and how it could affect the patentability of his invention. I encouraged him to do a patent search first to see if his idea had already been patented. But he was insistent. His invention was unique, and I just didn't understand it the way he did. Against my advice, he decided to file a patent application without doing proper research. After a few months, the patent office rejected his application, stating that there were already similar patents for the product he had described. This rejection sent him into a spiral of disbelief. He blamed me for not fighting harder for his idea and demanded I file an appeal. I explained the reasons for the rejection, and that filing an appeal wouldn't change the fact that his invention didn't meet the criteria for originality. But it didn't end there. He became obsessed with the idea of getting his patent approved and started sending me angry emails, insisting that I push the boundaries of the law and find a way to get him a patent. I repeatedly told him that it wasn't possible to get a patent on something that wasn't original, but he wouldn't listen. Finally, after months of futile effort, he dropped the case and filed for a refund. He claimed that I had been too cautious and hadn't done enough. It was a painful reminder that some clients can be so emotionally invested in their ideas that they lose sight of the reality of the legal system. I still don't know if he ever truly understood why his invention was rejected, but I learned a valuable lesson about managing client expectations. Story 18. I'm a corporate lawyer, and a few years ago I represented a small but ambitious startup. The company was trying to secure funding from venture capitalists, and they needed legal advice on everything from shareholder agreements to intellectual property protection. The problem, however, was the CEO, a young entrepreneur who was eager to get things done but lacked any real understanding of the legal complexities involved. When we first started working together, I explained the importance of protecting their intellectual property and ensuring that their contracts with investors were solid. But the CEO didn't want to spend time on what he considered boring legal stuff. Instead, he was obsessed with closing the deal and pushing forward with product development. Every time we reached a point where I needed him to sign something critical or provide documentation, he would delay or, worse, completely ignore my email. The tipping point came when we were finalizing a deal with a major investor. The investor wanted to include certain clauses in the shareholder agreement to protect their stake, but the CEO refused. He believed that any restriction on his decision-making would be too controlling. I tried to explain how important it was to have these safeguards in place, especially for the long-term stability of the company, but he wouldn't hear it. He continued to push back, asking me to modify the contract repeatedly without understanding the legal implications of his changes. I warned him that without the right protections, he was setting the company up for failure, but he insisted that his way was the best. Eventually, the investor pulled out of the deal, and the company lost a major opportunity. The CEO blamed me for not selling him harder on the terms, even though I had done everything I could to protect his interests. In the end, the startup had to go back to square one, and the CEO ended up learning a hard lesson about the importance of legal guidance. I, on the other hand, learned that no matter how hard you try to help some clients, they're not always ready to listen. Story 19. I specialize in family law, and one of the most difficult clients I've had to deal with was a man going through a contentious child custody battle. He came to me seeking full custody of his 2 children, claiming that his ex-wife was unfit to care for them due to her emotional instability and substance abuse. His case appeared to have merit, but as we delved deeper, it became clear that his motivations were far less noble than he had initially portrayed. While I was initially sympathetic to his situation, it didn't take long for me to realize that he was less concerned with the well-being of his children and more focused on winning the case. He would regularly make extreme demands, asking me to file motions for full custody, even when there was no clear evidence of neglect or abuse on his ex-wife's part. He also repeatedly badmouthed her to me, insisting that she was unfit to be a mother, even though there was little to back up his claims. When I suggested that we consider mediation or some form of joint custody, he became hostile, claiming that any arrangement that involved shared custody would be a win for her, and therefore unacceptable. He wanted to be the sole custodian, no matter what. It became clear that he was willing to use the children as pawns in his fight with his ex-wife. The worst part came when he started to manipulate the situation by planting seeds of doubt in his children's minds. He would encourage them to say things during their visits with him that made it seem like they didn't want to go back to their mother. When I confronted him about this unethical behavior, he became defensive and insisted that he was just giving them a voice. Ultimately, the court sided with a more reasonable approach, joint custody. But what was most frustrating was that his obsession with winning made an already difficult case even more emotionally charged. He never truly considered what was in the best interest of his children, and it showed in his behavior throughout the entire process. Story 20. As a construction lawyer, I've dealt with a lot of contractors and builders, but one client stands out for all the wrong reasons. He was a contractor who had been hired for a commercial renovation project. The job was large and complex, but I had worked with the client on smaller projects before and thought things would go smooth. Boy, was I wrong. Right from the start, he was difficult to communicate with. He would miss deadlines, ignore calls, and then turn up with excuses, claiming he had been too busy with other projects. As the project went on, it became clear that he was consistently cutting corners. He used substandard materials, hired unqualified workers, and ignored important safety protocols. When I raised concerns about his work, he would become defensive and dismissive. Things escalated when one of the subcontractors he hired filed a lawsuit for unpaid wages. I tried to step in and mediate the situation, but my client refused to pay the subcontractor, arguing that they didn't do the job right. The situation was getting messier by the day, and he kept making excuses instead of taking responsibility. At the end of the project, the building was left in disarray with incomplete work and safety violations. The client was furious when the owner of the property refused to pay the final installment due to the poor quality of the work. Rather than negotiating a solution, my client threatened to sue the property owner for breach of contract. I had to step in to explain that his failure to meet the terms of the agreement was the reason the property owner withheld payment. In the end, the contractor lost his reputation in the industry, and I had to take a lot of time to help him clean up the mess. The whole experience was a painful reminder that some clients refuse to listen to professional advice, and their own lack of accountability often leads to disaster. Story 21. As a criminal defense attorney, I've represented all kinds of clients, but one that sticks in my mind was a man accused of embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from his employer. When he first came to me, he swore up and down that he was innocent. His story was convincing. He said the evidence against him was fabricated and that the company had made a mistake. I could see his panic, and I tried to remain objective and offer him the best legal advice I could. However, as the case progressed, I began to uncover more inconsistencies in his story. He insisted he was completely innocent, but the evidence showed otherwise. Bank records, emails, and even surveillance footage all pointed to him being involved in the embezzlement. When I brought this up to him, he became defensive, insisting that someone was setting him up. His refusal to acknowledge the reality of the situation made things much harder. Every time I tried to get him to cooperate and focus on a plea deal, he resisted, thinking that going to trial would somehow clear his name. As we got closer to the trial, he became increasingly erratic in his behavior, showing up to meetings late and sending me long, rambling emails with new theories about what really happened. At one point, he asked me to present evidence that he didn't even work at the company during the time of the alleged theft, which was, of course, completely false. I tried to explain to him that denying the facts and going to trial with no strong defense would lead to a much worse outcome. Despite my efforts, he chose to go to trial. The case was a disaster. The jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. After the verdict, he still refused to accept responsibility, continuing to claim he was innocent. He blamed me for the outcome, saying, "I didn't fight hard enough." It was a tough case, but his refusal to confront the truth was what ultimately sealed his fate. It's a reminder of how important it is to be realistic and open to advice, especially when facing serious charges. Story 22. I work in environmental law, and one of my worst clients was a small-time developer who came to me seeking advice about building a commercial property on land that was located in a protected wetland area. The project had the potential to bring in a significant profit, and he was eager to get started. The only problem? The land was subject to environmental protection laws that prohibited construction in certain areas. From the moment we started discussing his plans, it was clear that he didn't take environmental regulations seriously. He repeatedly insisted that the regulations didn't apply to him and that the local authorities would look the other way if he just moved forward with the project. I advised him that it was essential to go through the proper channels and secure the necessary permits before proceeding. But he was insistent that everyone else was doing it, and he didn't need to bother with all the red tape. At one point, he even suggested I help him work around the regulations by altering the permit applications to avoid drawing attention to certain parts of the property. I was appalled by this suggestion and made it clear that I wouldn't participate in anything that violated the law. Despite my warnings, he decided to go ahead and start construction without the required permits. Predictably, the local government caught wind of the project and issued a cease and desist order. My client, however, refused to stop, convinced that his actions would go unnoticed. Eventually, the matter escalated to a lawsuit, and he faced heavy fines and legal fees for violating environmental laws. In the end, he was forced to halt the project entirely and dismantle most of the construction. What frustrated me most was his total disregard for the law. He was willing to risk everything for the sake of getting a quick return, and he refused to take any responsibility for his actions. It was a painful reminder of how some clients believe they can bypass the rules, only to end up with costly consequences. Story 23. I've had my fair share of clients in the real estate, but one stands out as particularly difficult. He was a wealthy investor who had hired me to handle a series of commercial property transactions. He seemed reasonable at first, but as we got deeper into the deals, it became clear that he was obsessed with micromanaging every detail. Every time I presented him with a contract or legal document, he would comb through it with a fine-tooth comb, finding even the smallest discrepancies and demanding I make changes. He would then send me long, late-night emails with his thoughts and revisions, and when I tried to explain why certain terms were non-negotiable or standard practice, he would argue and insist on modifications. At one point, we were negotiating a multi-million-dollar lease agreement, and he wanted to change the entire payment structure to something that wasn't even feasible under the current market conditions. I spent hours trying to explain why his suggestion was unrealistic, but he refused to budge. The constant back and forth made it impossible to make any progress. Things came to a head when he accused me of not being aggressive enough in negotiating the terms with the other party. He seemed to think that the more aggressive I was, the better the outcome would be, regardless of the fact that the other party had a legitimate business to run as well. His lack of understanding of the negotiation process only made things more difficult. Eventually, we got the deal signed, but it wasn't without major delays and unnecessary revisions. He ended up with a contract that didn't serve his interest as well as it could have, and all I could do was sigh in frustration. His constant interference and unrealistic expectations made what should have been a simple deal into a long, drawn-out nightmare. Story 24. I'm a bankruptcy lawyer, and one of the most challenging clients I've ever worked with was a small business owner who came to me after his company went under. He had taken on a massive amount of debt and could no longer meet his financial obligations. When we first met, he was optimistic and convinced that filing for bankruptcy would be a fresh start. But as we discussed his options, I quickly realized that he wasn't being completely forthcoming. He had a habit of hiding assets and refusing to disclose certain transactions that had taken place before the bankruptcy filing. Every time I asked for financial documentation, he would provide incomplete or falsified records, claiming they were lost or misplaced. Despite my warnings, he continued to withhold crucial information, hoping that the bankruptcy court wouldn't notice. It was clear he wasn't treating the situation with the seriousness it deserved. He wanted to use bankruptcy as a way to wipe away his debts while keeping his assets, and he believed that I could somehow manipulate the process to his benefit. When I refused to engage in anything that could be considered fraudulent, he became angry and started sending me hostile emails, accusing me of ruining his chances. Eventually, the court began to investigate his finances more closely, and it didn't take long for them to uncover the discrepancies. My client ended up facing criminal charges for bankruptcy fraud, and his business collapsed completely. Not only did he lose everything, but he also ended up with a criminal record. The whole experience was a painful reminder that some people are willing to go to extreme lengths to avoid facing the consequences of their actions, even when the legal system is there to help them start fresh. Story 25. As a personal injury lawyer, I've seen a lot of people seeking compensation for injuries sustained in accidents. But there was one client who took things to a new level. He came to me after a car accident, claiming he had suffered a serious back injury that would prevent him from ever working again. His medical records didn't show any major issues, but he was insistent that his condition was severe. He presented me with a stack of medical bills and wanted me to sue the driver who had caused the accident for all he could get. I was skeptical from the start. He was asking for an outrageous amount of compensation, more than I thought was reasonable given the severity of his injury. As we started to dig into his case, I noticed inconsistencies in his story. He claimed he couldn't work due to his back injury, but his social media posts showed him lifting heavy objects at home and playing sports with friends. When I confronted him about it, he brushed it off, claiming that it wasn't a big deal. The more I investigated, the more it became clear that he was exaggerating his injury in hopes of getting a large payout. He refused to provide full documentation of his medical history, and every time we got closer to a settlement, he would suddenly change his demands, asking for more money or threatening to take the case to trial. Eventually, I realized that he wasn't interested in a fair settlement. He was looking for a big payday, and the truth didn't matter to him. After months of trying to negotiate a reasonable settlement, I had to drop the case. I wasn't willing to go along with his fraudulent behavior, and I couldn't risk my reputation for a dishonest claim. It was one of the toughest decisions I've had to make, but ultimately, I had to put my professional integrity first. Story 26. I work as a landlord-tenant attorney, and one of my most challenging clients was a landlord who hired me to handle a particularly contentious eviction case. The tenant had been living in the apartment for several years and had always been late on rent. But this time, they had stopped paying altogether. The landlord, understandably frustrated, wanted the tenant out as quickly as possible. When I first met with the landlord, he seemed reasonable enough, explaining his grievances. But as the case progressed, I realized that he was far less interested in following the legal process than he was in getting revenge on his tenant. He began making demands that went against the law, trying to force the tenant out with threats and intimidation. Every time I advised him to stick to the proper legal channels, he would dismiss my advice and insist that the tenant deserved harsher treatment. One of the more bizarre requests was when he asked me to draft a letter to the tenant demanding an immediate payment of 3 months' rent. Even though the tenant had already offered a payment plan that was more than reasonable, the landlord insisted on sending it. And when I told him that doing so could violate tenant protection laws, he got angry and accused me of being too lenient. Things reached a boiling point when the landlord started trying to lock the tenant out of the apartment, despite the fact that eviction could only happen after the court order. He would regularly call me asking why I hadn't forced the tenant out yet. I tried to explain the risks of breaking the law, but he was adamant that I should just do whatever it took to get his property back. Eventually, the case went to court, and the tenant was granted more time to move out. My client ended up with a legal bill that was much higher than anticipated due to the constant delays he caused. He still blamed me for not getting the eviction done faster. It was a tough experience because, in the end, I wasn't able to convince him to follow the right path, and he paid a heavy price for his impatience. Story 27. I'm an estate planning lawyer, and I once worked with a woman who hired me to create a will and trust for her family. She had a large estate and wanted to ensure everything was divided fairly between her children when she passed away. Initially, everything seemed straightforward, but as we started the process, I realized she was far more complicated than I had anticipated. She would make contradictory requests, changing her mind constantly. At one point, she wanted to leave her primary residence to one child, but then, after further discussion, she wanted to sell it and split the proceeds among all the children. That's when things started to get really messy. One of her children had recently gone through a difficult divorce, and the mother was concerned that if she left them anything of significant value, it could be claimed in the divorce proceeding. When I suggested that we include specific provisions to protect her assets, she seemed satisfied, but then the requests started coming in. One day, she asked me to secretly leave a sum of money to one child but to hide it from the others, fearing they would fight over it. Another day, she wanted to change who would serve as the executor of her estate, then change it again, depending on her fluctuating relationships with her children. The worst part was when she insisted that I include a clause that would disinherit any child who disrespected her wishes. But she refused to define what disrespect meant. This created a legal gray area that could lead to complications after her death. I spent hours trying to explain to her the ramifications of such provisions, but she would simply brush off my concerns and tell me, "This is what I want, and it's my money." In the end, she passed away before finalizing the will. The family fought over the estate for years, and much of what she intended to protect was lost in legal battles. The entire experience showed me that some clients, no matter how much you try to advise them, will insist on making decisions based on emotion, not reason, leading to unintended consequences.